Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's episode we're going to talk about the phosphate regulation. I have uploaded a video about the calcium regulation. If you haven't checked it out, please, I highly encourage you to watch that first before coming here, because these two electrolytes are very tied together when it comes to the regulation, and I explained some basic into the calcium regulation that will help understand the phosphate regulation. So please check it out. Now, when we talk about phosphate regulation, it's important because phosphate is also the major anion into our cell, and it's implicated into the synthesis of ATP, which is the readily energy available for the cell into our body system. It's also with the calcium main electrolyte when talking about bones and teeth. So phosphate is also important. Now, the phosphate regulation is not gonna be that wide as calcium regulation. The main hormone that regulates phosphate is also the main one that is regulated calcium, which is why they are tied together. It's gonna be the parathyroid secreted by our parathyroid glands. So let's see how this is gonna be going. So the parathyroid, when we have a decrease in calcium, the parathyroid is gonna sense the decrease in calcium and increase its level. Now, when the parathyroid increases its level, it's gonna act on 3 different organs. It's gonna act on the kidneys, it's gonna act on the GI tract and the bones. Now, all this action is gonna be to increase the level of calcium back to the normal and excrete the level of phosphate. So the mnemonic I have to actually remember the action of the parathyroid on the calcium and the phosphate is PTH for parathyroid, which is phosphate trash hormone. So I know if this is a phosphate trash hormone, it's gonna help the reabsorption of calcium, because I know they work different. If calcium is high, phosphate is low. If phosphate is high, calcium is low. So this is just a simple tip to remember how parathyroid worked on each electrolyte. Now let's go back here. So on the kidney, the parathyroid is going to increase the reabsorption of calcium and favor the excretion of phosphate. Remember, phosphate trash hormone. Excretion of phosphate. So in the GI tract, same thing, favor the reabsorption of calcium and decrease the level of phosphate. In the bone, it's going to be the same thing, favor the reabsorption of calcium and decrease the level of phosphate. I spoke about all this into my calcium regulation, which is why I'm going through. Please check out that video if you haven't. Now, at this point, we can understand that every time that we have a high level of calcium, our phosphate is going to be low. They are inversely related, right? And I'm gonna go back a little bit, and the normal level of phosphate that we use is gonna be 2.5 to 4.5 milligram per deciliter. So every time that I talk about low phosphate, it's less than 2.5 for the purpose of the video, or every time that I talk about high phosphate, it's greater than 4.5. So every time that we have a high level of calcium, the normal level of calcium is 8.5 to 10.5 milligram per deciliter. Now these levels are going to vary according to hospital or certain books. So every time that the calcium is high, the phosphate is low. Every time that the phosphate is high, the calcium is low through the parathyroid hormone regulation. So at the end of this mechanism, at the end of it all, we're gonna have increased calcium level here and decreased phosphate level. Now, let's talk about how can we end up with a low level of calcium versus a high level of calcium. What are the signs and symptoms, and how can we briefly treat the situation? So let's start with the high level of high level of phosphate. Sorry. So in order to have high level of phosphate, we can have increased phosphate in the diet. We can have parathyroid insufficiency, not secreting enough parathyroid hormone, increases our level of phosphate. And we can also have kidneys problem, kidney deficiency, because if you have a kidney that doesn't respond to the PTH, to the parathyroid hormone increase, we are not going to have that excretion of phosphate, which is going to increase our level of phosphate at the end. So these are the situations that can give us hyperphosphate. And what are the signs and symptoms? So remember, we say if the phosphate is high, the calcium is going to be low because they are inversely related. And on the video talking about the calcium regulation, we said normally calcium inhibits the sodium intake during the action potential, the depolarization phase. So if we have less calcium, we don't have that inhibition. So we're going to have an increase in the sodium influx during the action potential right here. So here we're going to have an increase into the sodium influx, which is going to depolarize the membrane, making the cells more excitable. How is this going to translate? So if everything is excitable, we're going to have the signs and symptoms of hyperphosphatemia is going to correlate with the signs and symptoms of hypocalcemia. So everything is going to be fast and high. We're going to have the spasm. Remember, we talked about laryngospasm, bronchospasm, dysphagia, hyperreflexibility, our tendon reflex is going to be really hyper. And we also going to have signs and symptoms like we talked about a Trousseau sign when inflating a blood pressure curve, giving us a flexion of the wrist. And we talked about a Chvostek sign when you tap right here in front of the ears, it's going to give you stretches on the same side. So all these are going to translate into the signs and symptoms of hyperphosphatemia. Trousseau and Chvostek. Now, in the situation of hyperphosphatemia, we said that phosphate and calcium bind together into our body system just in places like bones and teeth. But when we have high level of phosphate into the body, these phosphates are going to bind to the calcium and form some crystal, and those crystals are going to be deposited in the kidneys, on the skin, on the liver, in various organs, and even in the blood vessels. So we're going to have that as well. Deposit of crystal in various body systems. So now, how do we treat? if you have high level of phosphate, you want to decrease the level of phosphate. You want to restrict phosphate from the diet, because we saw that one cause of the increase of phosphate could be the diet. You want to fix the underlying situation. If it's the PTH insufficiency, if it's the kidney disease, you also want to fix that. But you also want to give phosphate binders. You can give calcium acetate, Emphogel. They are all calcium phosphate binders, which is going to help bind that phosphate and increase the excretion of phosphate. So this is all about hyperphosphatemia. Now let's talk about situation that can actually lead to a decrease in our blood phosphate. Hypophosphatemia. These are going to be things like decrease in the diet. If we are not getting enough phosphate, it can lead to that. But let's go back here, which say that calcium and phosphate are inversely regulated. So if we have situations that are going to decrease our phosphate, it's going to be situations that actually increase our calcium. So if we have a high level of PTH, so if we have a tumor that is secreting a protein that acts just as the PTH, we can have that. Or if we have kidneys that are not working properly, flushing the calcium, and if we have intoxication with alcohol, alcohol is going to decrease the reabsorption of phosphate. And also during malnutrition syndrome, like the refeeding syndrome, like when you give carbohydrate after a long period of starvation, phosphate is going to diminish, because phosphate is going to go into the cell in order to help producing the ATP. So also these are the mechanisms that can help decrease the level of phosphate with feeding syndrome. Now, what are the signs and symptoms? Remember, low phosphate, high calcium. And we said calcium normally inhibits the sodium influx. So if the calcium is high, we're going to have a decrease in the depolarization on our membrane. And if we have a decrease in the depolarization, the cells are going to be less excitable. So everything is going to be slow. So we're going to have like decreased GI motility when you have constipation. We're also going to have hyporeflexia. All the signs and symptoms of hypercalcemia, we're going to have headaches, lethargy. So these are some signs of symptoms that we can have. And with a low phosphate, what do? So we just increase the consumption of phosphate. We can give phosphate orally or through IV fluid, which is going to solve the problem of hypophosphatemia. So this is what I got for the phosphate regulation. Like I said, it's really tied into the calcium regulation. So I highly suggest to watch the calcium regulation video first before diving into the phosphate regulation. If you like this video, please subscribe, like, and share, and leave a comment below. Thank you, and see you on my next video.